Okay, who out there likes watching horror movies? Now, I went through a phase where I used to like them, not so much anymore. But the reason I ask you that is because think of that scary moment where the suspense is high, the anxiety's building, and then it happens. The killer attacks. Now, you may be asking yourself what this episode has to do with horror movies or the other way around. Well, let me tell you another scary story. Did you know that only 32% of employees are engaged at work and 52% are actively looking for a new job? 52%, 1 out of every 2 are looking to go somewhere else. Now, that to me is pretty scary. Hey, everyone, Dr. Jones here, the host of the Seeing to Lead podcast, a podcast designed to help leaders solve their everyday problems by having people on with different viewpoints, different perspectives, and proven strategies to help you do just that. And this week, we hear from Tom Willis. Now, Tom is the co-founder of Phoenix Partners and the co-author of The Great Engagement. His work is all around the idea of getting people engaged in their work, which then we can easily translate into getting students engaged in their work. One of the things you're going to love about this episode is that he connects this to science, and he talks about the default success strategy that we have in education being oriented on the past instead of the future, when we should be helping students realize their greatest potential and supporting them in reaching it. And Tom lays out a simple formula. Don't mistake simple for easy to enact, but a simple formula. Engagement is aspiration times empowerment. If we can figure out how to implement this, we're going to increase engagement and increase students' success. 2 things Tom says that really resonate with me. It's the idea that coaching others is about being coachable ourselves. And coaching is only successful if it's genuinely asked for. And the other piece of this is feedback, because feedback is part of the coaching process. But when we ask someone if they're open to feedback, it wires their brain the same as if they were hearing footsteps in the dark behind them. That's right, that feeling you get when you're waiting for the killer to pounce in a horror movie. Look, this episode has a ton of fantastic information. I can't recommend more that you pick up Tom's book, read through it, and then get in touch with him to schedule a follow-up session so that you can benefit from the strategies he provides. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, rate, and review this show. It helps out more than you can ever imagine. I'd be especially grateful if you take to socials and share with your greatest takeaway. I'm sure you're going to have plenty after listening to Tom Willis discuss the great engagement on Seeing to Lead.
The key here is that you can conspire for somebody or you can conspire against them. Gossip is a passive complaint with no commitment to helping somebody else. So it's conspiring against them. But it's okay if you and I are talking about how to help Sally, we're conspiring for her because our intention is to help her. So it's okay if we talk about that so we can put a plan together to help her. And too often we don't think about it that way. We just go straight to, oh my gosh, can you believe it?
Dr. Chris Jones here, and welcome to Seeing to Lead, a show designed to help leaders increase their ability to effectively support, engage, and empower their staff through intentional practices so that they create an environment where everyone reaches their greatest level of success. On Seeing to Lead, communication rules the day as we hear voices from both teachers and leaders in an effort to examine perspectives, highlight misunderstandings, and provide steps to ultimately bridge the gap between what teachers need and provide through thoughtful dialogue. This show is about amplifying voices, creating understanding, and providing information to help everyone continually improve. I want to personally thank you for taking the time. Now, let's get to getting better. Tom Willis believes we are all born with unlimited potential. As a former classroom teacher, he also believes in the power of lifelong learning. These beliefs have shaped his primary goal in life, helping others move beyond their self-limiting beliefs so they can reach their God-given potential. Prior to co-founding Phoenix Partners, he had the great honor of serving as CEO for Cornerstone, a school system in Detroit. He was fortunate to earn an engineering degree from the University of Michigan and an MBA from the University of Notre Dame. He thanks God every day for his amazing wife and 3 wonderful children. 3 words used on Tom's website to describe him are trustworthy, discerning, and strategic. These mean a lot when looking for a leader in any organization. I'm certain that Tom is going to offer a ton of value to the listeners today. I have to also mention, partly because we're going to be talking about it, is the new book he co-authored with Brad Zimmerman titled The Great Engagement. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a great conversation. And I have to say, because this is actually, something I want to ask you from the beginning. People can't see it because we're not on video. The title of your book is Better Seen Than Heard. And it's The Great Resignation with a line drawn through resignation and engagement in its place. And in your book, you talk about the difference between disengagement and resignation. So I figured that'd be a good spot. If you can explain to us a little bit about that and how that kind of feeds into the purpose of your book and what else we'll find in there.
Yeah. So what would you guess is the percent of engaged employees out there in the workforce according to Gallup?
I would say it's pretty low. I would say engaged employees is under 40%.
Yeah, almost exactly. About 32%, I think, was the last number. And that's an uptick. That's an improvement from previous years. And that is pathetic. It's really sad. It bums me out that there's that many people who just aren't engaged in what they do. They just don't care. They're sort of hanging out or quiet quitting, all the things we've heard about. And up to 51% of them are actively looking for a new job or open to a new job. So that means that 51% of your people, if you're a superintendent listening to this right now, 51% of your people, yes, your people, are likely open to going somewhere else. And that's on us as leaders, I think. That's on us as superintendents to shape a better culture where people love it and they want to stay. They don't have to love it every day, because that's impossible. But if you're not getting better every day, then you're getting worse. There is no such thing as coasting, because if you're coasting on a bike, the only way to coast is by going downhill.
Absolutely. And just so people can hear that and think about it, I think about a district. And I think about if you have, say, 300 employees, we can save 50%. But what's really staggering is to think that 100 people in a 300-person district are open to taking another job, walking out the door. And then that number gets uglier when you're talking about principals and their staff. I have 60 some odd people on my staff. Let's call it 60 for a round number. That means at any point, 30 people on my staff are looking at other jobs or would be open to another job because of engagement. Those numbers, when I saw that in your book, they're staggering.
Yeah.
If we think about it.
And we're quick to be like, well, it's because, this, and it's because of that, and it's because of, the pay, and it's because the state and the funding model, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, yeah, maybe partially, but that doesn't really get you anywhere as a leader. It's better to adopt a mindset that it's because of me, and I need to go to work to make it better.
And so that's where, when we talk about engagement or disengagement, because I do a lot of talking about engagement and being engaged and how you can engage employees at work, how you can engage staff members, students, and all of that. But one of the things I liked is the difference you drew between the idea of disengagement, because if we have a problem like this and we work to fix it, quite often our efforts can go to the wrong place, because resignation to me is a pretty powerful word because of what it describes. And so how do we as leaders look at this issue differently and look at it from a lens of engaging those that may not be disengaged, but may be struggling with resignation?
Well, yeah, I wish I had a quick answer and a magic potion for Chris. Like you said before we started the recording, that this stuff is easy to get. It's very hard to bring it to life and to make an impact. But it starts with just the simple acknowledgement that things could be better. Too often we spend our time spinning on what we call the current reality and mostly the past. And we need to get focused on the future. That's not complicated. but we're so quick, especially in the education space, we found that we have an orientation towards the past. We have a default success strategy, as we call it, that's oriented towards the past. And it's great because it creates very stable environments and ones that have what we would call sort of a high need for perfection of doing things well. So those are great things, right? You want your kindergarten teacher to provide a very stable, loving environment for the students. That's great 95% of the time. The other 5% of the time, it's not so good because it tends to be very focused on the past and how have we done things before. And that creates a great deal of conventionality that ultimately doesn't serve moving forward and making things better at times.
Kind of the way we've always done things.
Yeah.
Is, one of my most hated phrases. And that's what I kept thinking to myself when I talked about that default success strategy. But I never thought of it. And I wonder how many principals feel this way, or how many leaders or whatever level you're leading at feel this way when it comes to change. And the idea of a default success strategy, I started thinking about how that affects a person's unwillingness to change. And when I was doing my doctoral work, one of the side findings that I had to do with how much a person was willing to change based on where that change landed within or up against their original reason for entering the education profession. So, the further, it was a continuum, the further away the change seemed to be or was perceived to be from their original set of values for getting into education, the more resistant to that change they were. Where this says that it's not necessarily that. This default success strategy has me thinking about why people are resistant to change differently. And that it's not so much that it's against what they believe in, but it's more of, one, the fear, right, of doing something that it might not be so great at or that it might not work. And two, why would they do something different than what they already know works? It's almost like I look at it as if somebody's on a factory line doing widgets and they put a widget together a certain way because they know that that widget comes off that line in a certain way because they put it together that certain way. Where if they don't, it doesn't work. That's great for factory lines and widgets, not so much for people. So how do we push people off that? How do we get people out of that area of comfort?
Yeah, great question. And so a few thoughts. One is that our brain chemistry is working against us. We were just talking to a doctor down in Nashville, a really fascinating guy, really smart. And he said the latest brain research on the amygdala, and the amygdala stands for almond because we've got these two almond-shaped objects behind our ears as a part of our brain that are sensing, fear. They get us into fight, flight, freeze sort of reactions. The latest research is that the amygdala are actually novelty detectors. So if you stop and think about that, it's really fascinating that our brains are wired to detect and to have a fear-based reaction to anything that's novel, anything that's different. And that's not a bad thing. That makes us human. The challenge is that it happens unconsciously and it happens in fractions of a second, and we don't even notice it. So one of the biggest challenges is that we tend to label people like, well, they're stuck, or they're fixed-minded, or they're not growth-minded, or they're whatever. Well, the reality is we're all fixed and we're all growth-minded. We're all stuck and we're all unstuck. We're complex. We human beings are very complex. And labeling people is not a great place to start as a leader. It's better to say, look, we all do this stuff. We all do it all the time. The challenge is that most of the time, we're not even aware of it. We're completely unconscious to it. You said people are unwilling to change. Well, they are, but for the most part, they don't even know why, and it's unconscious to even them. It's below the surface of consciousness. And so that's what makes a lot of this work when you go to improve a team and improve a culture, why most of it doesn't work and why there's a lot of fatigue, frankly, around leadership development work is because most of it feels good. It's kind of like going to a conference or hearing a keynote. It feels good, but within a few days or even a few hours, it wears off and it doesn't work because we completely miss that if we're going to make this effectual, if we're going to make this work, we have to get at people's unconscious motivations. And my business partner's dad was a B-52 pilot and just a fascinating guy. I never got a chance to meet him, unfortunately, but apparently he liked to say that we're all stuck in a fur-lined rut. It's a rut, but it's lined with fur, so it's quite comfortable. And so we're all stuck in this comfort zone. And the problem is outside of that comfort zone is where we learn and where we grow. But there's this line in between the two. There's a line between the comfort zone and the learning zone called fear. And for some people, they're going to say, oh, I'm not afraid of anything. Yeah, it's BS. I'm not fear driven. Well, just consider it. Okay. You're human and very likely you're being driven by fear and you don't even know it, because we all are. The challenge is, how do you become aware of it? And so we can get into more of that if that's helpful, but that's really at the foundational level, is that if you're going to make an impact on a team, on a culture, you got to go to work on helping people become aware of their unconscious fears.
So, and I love the last part you said, their unconscious fears, because one of the things I was thinking about when you said we can dive a little more into that, which I'd love to do, about how we help people recognize those and deal with them, because we can't make progress unless we take that first step to do that. But I think of myself talking to somebody and they won't do it, and now I'm armed with just enough to be dangerous to say, it's because of fear, and saying, what are you afraid of? They don't even know. Yeah, you're making the timeout sign.
Yeah, don't do that. Definitely don't do that.
And that's why I like that you said it's an unconscious fear. They don't know. But how do leaders or anybody trying to institute a change address that, especially when it's unconscious? Are there a set of exercises we can go through to help people recognize that? Because you're right, that is out there that, I'm not afraid of anything. This change doesn't make me afraid. I just know it's not going to work. So.
Are you trying to sell our book here, Chris? I love it. Yes, there are tools.
Well, I love your book, so.
There are tools in the book. We tried to make it a good mix of novel insights, of models, mental models that are super simple. We like to try to simplify stuff as much as possible. We can talk about engagement and our formula for that. By the way, I completely forgot to do that. But there are some great tools in there. And one of them is what we call the Elevate system, which is our own 4-factor behavioral model. It's similar to like DISC or Myers-Briggs. It's different in that we really work hard not to label people, that, you're not a insert the blank, ENTJ. You may default to that. That may be your default, but it doesn't mean that you're stuck that way. And too often we use these things as like fixed labels. And so, becoming aware of it yourself is one of the first steps. And to realize that it's not a bad thing. Again, this is what it means to be a human being. So if you're a mechanic, what do you need to know about? You need to know about how a car engine works, right? If you're a leader, what do you need to know about? You need to know about how the human mind works and how the human spirit works and how we are motivated or not motivated. Because emotion has the same root as motion. If you want to get people to move towards a different future, you want to put them in motion, then you got to figure out the emotions involved. That's not a bad thing. It's an acknowledgement of reality, frankly. We tell people to leave their emotions at home. That's like saying, I'm going to work on your car, but I'm not going to touch your engine. It's ridiculous. It's just a silly notion. So to be an effective leader is to know what it means to work with the human being. We unfortunately struggle with this, especially in education. And it's right there in front of us. So I'll give you an example. Social and emotional learning, right? SEL is very popular. It's all over the place. We are teaching kids the tactics and what it means and the ideas behind SEL. But in most schools, I shouldn't say most, in many schools, the adults are not being, and kids are the ultimate BS detectors. They know that teacher and that teacher don't like each other. So don't try to teach me about being socially and emotionally aware when you adults can't do it.
Well, one of the best things is that the kids are the best BS detectors. They are. And it's interesting when we try to do those and incorporate SEL strategies, how a lot of, and you might even be able to get away with most, schools have trouble pulling it off because of the adults in the building. One of the things that really stuck out to me is leaving your emotions at home. And when you said that, I jotted it down with exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point. One of the things I think really hit leaders all at once is that during COVID and coming back from COVID, adults in the building students as well, but adults in the building were dealing with so much. That effort to leave their emotions at home was no longer a successful strategy. And I think it really brought it to the forefront of just how they couldn't do that. I remember having conversations with colleagues that had worked together for 20, 25 years. Suddenly they were realizing things about their next door neighbor that they never noticed before because they couldn't just leave it at home, what was going on in their private life at home, and come in and teach. There was too much. They were just overflowing with emotion from everything that was going on. And that rubber band, once it's been stretched, can never go back. And so instead of trying to ignore it, I think one of the problems that leaders are facing is that we don't know how to deal with it, and that they don't know how to deal with it because it's there and it's something that always needs to be dealt with. So how do we go about dealing with rolling the emotions in and making sure that we are acknowledging them and offering support for them?
The short answer is to listen the greatness out of your people, to listen the greatness out of your people. That much of it's a new world now, right? We can't deny that. And the tools that used to work 20 years ago are no longer effective. And one of the best tools we have now is coaching. But we don't know how to do that. Most of us don't know how to do that. I certainly didn't when I was a superintendent. I've only recently learned that in the last probably 8 years. Fundamentally, you've got to listen to people much more than we were used to. Now, this isn't a Pollyanna sort of just listen and listen and listen and listen. No, that doesn't work. You have to use it along with your other tools in your toolkit. And we think there's really 3 primary tools: leadership, management, and coaching. And you got to use all 3. But in this particular case, you've got to really help people by just listening to them. And there are boundaries you have to put in place. We're not talking about, you get to just emote whatever you want to emote. There's still a level of professionalism and that's required within any work context, right? So this isn't just letting people, spout out whatever they want to talk about. I'm not saying that, but we do need to just be there more for people too, because most of the time people just need to be heard and then they can move on. They can be more productive and effective.
So it's interesting. I find it interesting that you say you didn't really know that much about coaching until a few years ago. I myself have currently just gone through a year of a coach's training as I coach novice leaders. And you're right, it is different. So how do we get that across to the people that we lead, or get that across to other leaders so that it can then filter down? Is there a method that we can use where, besides direct instruction, right? And it takes practice, but is there a method we can get where people buy into that coaching piece and work with that coaching piece and accept those coaching ideals so that they can then use those in return?
Yeah, there's a lot. And clearly through coach training, we've been through hundreds of hours of coach training, and I still feel like I'm learning every day after 8 years of doing this. And most of what is out there is considered coaching is not coaching. So for instance, we talked about this before, but they've done studies on this, and asking somebody, hey, are you open to feedback, is like they've actually wired people's brains up, and they've figured out that asking somebody, are you open to feedback, is like hearing footsteps in the dark behind you, which shows how challenging this is to do it effectively. So 2 specific things. If you're a leader and you want to create a coaching culture, then you have to be coachable. Do nothing else for the next 2 months, but ask your people for coaching. And if you do that and actually listen to them, they will start doing the same. They'll start reciprocating because they'll be following your lead. We know this intellectually. It's not rocket science, but we don't do it because we're like, well, no. I don't want to get coached. I want to coach my people, right? So go be coachable. The second is coaching is only coaching if it's asked for. If it's asked for. And again, I made this same mistake. We would take our highest performing sort of teachers and we'd slap a label on them. We'd say, okay, next year you're going to be the SEL coach, or next year you're going to be the ELA coach, or you're going to be the math coach. And I had multiple campuses. So I was like, okay, now great. You're no longer a full-time teacher. You're just going to be a math coach. Go out and help all the teachers. And the teachers were like, what the hell are you doing in my classroom? Get out. They didn't say that, but that's basically what they were saying, right? Because they didn't ask for it. So you've got to create a culture where people are okay to say no. To say no, you know what, Chris, I'm not having it today. Like I'm up to here. I'm full and I just can't take your input. Can we talk again tomorrow or next week? Yeah, sure. So you got to have those types of relationships. You got to build big relationships so you can handle those conversations. But fundamentally, you got to ask, and people will call me. I'm a professional coach, right? People will literally call me and we set it up that way. So they call us. And halfway through the conversation, I'll actually say, hey, Bob, are you open to coaching? And they'll literally realize that no, they weren't until just that moment, even though they called me for coaching, right? So it shows that our brains start to shut down and we start to repel anything that's novel. And it's not because we're bad. It doesn't make us human beings bad. It's just what it is to be human. And so we've got to know again how the human spirit works.
Supporting your teachers and students seems to be a struggle. They just don't seem to be engaged. You wish they would take more responsibility for their learning and culture of the building, but they just don't seem to be empowered enough to do it. So, my question is, have you checked out the book Seeing to Lead yet? It's all about creating a true educational experience where learning, growth, leadership, and community takes center stage. Full of strategies and resources, Seeing to Lead is about attaining that goal by employing a model that supports, engages, and empowers all individuals to become leaders themselves. Pick up a copy today at seeingtolead.com. That's seeingtolead.com. Remember, you don't become a leader and then decide you need to support and recognize others more than yourself. It is the moment you realize it's about supporting and recognizing others that you become a leader. Seeingtolead.com. I like that you said that and you brought in the idea of we have to be ready to be coached ourselves and willing to be coached ourselves before we can ever coach anybody else. And it kind of ties into the engagement chapter in your book, or the engage chapter in your book. And you started off with a quote that really kind of struck me. And it's by Max Dupree. And the quote is, "The signs of outstanding leadership appear primarily among the followers." Now, I have an idea of what that means to me, but I'm curious as to why you used that at the beginning of the engage chapter.
Yeah, well, great question. So let's back up a second and talk about the formula for engagement, because we didn't talk about that yet. So we try to, again, simplify the heck out of this stuff as much as possible. And we think this is pretty darn good. It's probably not 100% perfect, but it's pretty close. That engagement is a matter of aspiration times empowerment. Aspiration is different than inspiration, right? What's the difference, Chris? How would you describe the difference between inspiration and aspiration?
Aspiration is something that I want to do, that I look forward to doing, that I'm striving for, where inspiration is something that drives me.
Yeah, and where do they come from? What's the source of those two?
Aspiration is inner and inspiration is outer.
Yeah, the intrinsic, right? Motivation. If you've got an aspiration, do I have to convince you? Do I have to get buy-in? So this is the key, is that inspiration is great, and absolutely leaders need inspiration. They need to be inspirational at times. But fundamentally, your goal is to find out, what do people care about? What do they aspire to? And too often we do this backwards. We get the vision, mission, values, whatever. All that stuff is all the same in my opinion, but that's a whole nother conversation. We throw it up on the wall and then we ask people to salute it, right? As opposed to the inverse of that is to say, hey, what do you care about? And what do you care about? And what do you care about? And actually help people to get clear about what's their purpose? What's their aspiration? And once that's clear and you understand it as a leader, then you can map it onto the purpose of your school or your organization. That's 1,000 times more powerful. But we don't do it because we don't want, because we've always done it the other way, right? Because consultants like me come in and tell you to wordsmith your vision statement for 72 hours, it's an exercise in futility and words. It's ridiculous. So that's aspiration. The second is empowerment, which is pretty straightforward, right? If you want, especially in the world of education, we've got highly educated, smart people, but most of them still, frankly, want to be told what to do, or they're so used to being told what to do that they don't even realize it. And so part of our job is to be like, well, no, you got a PhD, you got a master's degree. What do you think we should do? Well, how do you think we should do this? And empowering them with the responsibility to make stuff happen. And when people have an aspiration and they're empowered to do it, watch out. You don't have to convince them of anything. They're fully engaged. So coming back to your original question, Max Dupree, he's got some fascinating quotes, fascinating books, Leadership Jazz. And he talks about that if you want to know if you're an effective leader, then look at your people. Are they changing with grace? Are they open to input or coaching? Are they willing to collaborate? If your people aren't doing those things, then stop blaming them and get to work leading, because you're not doing an effective job leading. That's not a bad thing. I'm not wagging my finger at people. Part of this, again, goes back to leadership. We got to stop blaming and we got to start leading.
That's a fantastic way to explain that, because leadership, we do have to get to leading, but let me ask you this. How much, because we have different leadership styles, right? How much of leadership is what the followers are doing in conjunction with the leader's vision? So when we, like in Max Dupree's quote, it's outstanding leadership if the followers are all becoming leaders, or if they're all doing exactly what they're told. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, Max Dupree actually has some follow-up questions, which are not in the book, but they're things like, are people changing with grace? Now, as a leader, you get to decide, what do you want for your people, right? Having them do what you tell them to do is completely antiquated, and good luck with that strategy, okay? When I was a brand new superintendent, I was only 34 years old. I was like, yes, I made it. Now people do what I tell them to do. Well, it only took a few weeks to realize that's not going to work. That's not an effective leadership strategy. But you get to decide, what is it that you want your people to do? What is it that is important to you and your culture? So those are the metrics. And then measure yourself based on that. Measure yourself based on how are they doing 5 months later and 10 months later and 2 years later compared to where you started.
To me, this is all fascinating stuff. I could talk to you about this all the time. And you had made a comment earlier. You said, oh, you're really selling our book for us. That's because, and I want to definitely mention this because I'm also going to put it in the show notes and everything, but I did read your book before this discussion. And I have to tell the listeners, I really have to put a plug in for it. It really is a fantastic book. And because it's got the tools, and I believe I put it, I'm trying to think of how I put it to you, Tom, when we were talking before I actually hit record when I was going through it. It's because I believe that leadership is not complicated, but it's not easy. And I would put that same moniker on this book, that it's not a complicated book. You can read through it. It's formatted great. You move through it. You offer resources, but definitely not easy to put in place. But definitely something I think belongs on the shelves of people listening to this podcast.
Well, thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. And we worked quite hard at that, frankly. I think it was Abraham Lincoln that said at the end of some of his letters, sorry, this letter was so long. It would have been shorter if I had more time. And we pride ourselves on not having a lot of lingo and consultant speak and all that mumbo jumbo that people want to put out there to make it look like they're smart. We want to actually do the opposite. We want to keep it super, super elegant, meaning it's super simple. It's not easy to do, to your point, but it is, the simpler you can make it, the more likely it is that people will use it. And we'll put a couple of these tools, by the way, for the audience, for your listeners, if they want to check it out on our website. We created a landing page. It's just phoenixperform.com/seeing to lead. Obviously your podcast name. So phoenixperform.com/seeing to lead. And some of those tools, like one in particular, is a free engaged life inventory, we call it. So it's a great place to start your leadership journey if you're serious about this, is to stop and just slow down and think about, okay, where am I engaged in my own life? Because, CEO is a Chief Engagement Officer. Whether you have that title or not, we are all the CEO of our own life. We're all the CEO of our classroom if we're a teacher. And our job is to be the chief engagement officer, generating engagement in the classroom, for instance, if you're a teacher. But the only way you do that, not the only way, but one of the best ways to do that is to start with yourself and to just take 15 minutes, print out the engaged life inventory and see where are you engaging your life and where have you become a little bit resigned, frankly, where have you let some things get in the way of being more effective or more productive or more engaged.
See, I mean, they didn't even have to pick up your book and they're already getting tools from you. So I told everybody at the beginning, this would be a really helpful show. I'm glad we were able to touch on that. And, people hear something, they'll be able to see it in the show notes and then I'll put a link so they can just click it and get to it. But we're getting near the end of the podcast and there's 2 questions I ask everybody, but we can get to those unless you had something else you wanted to get to.
Well, I do. You asked me earlier to talk a little bit about like maybe a story or two. And I think, especially if you've got, superintendents listening, in the book, and this is based on 30 plus years of doing this work, frankly, from across the country, from Alaska to England and everywhere in between, that we've learned that there's really 12 cultural mindsets, we call them, that are at the foundation of all cultures. And some are productive and some not so much. I love this idea that we are all cultural ambassadors. We're either adding to the culture or we're subtracting from it. Again, there is no neutral. You're either adding to the culture or you're subtracting from it. That's an idea I stole from one of my favorite authors, Matthew Kelly. And the cultural mindsets that especially are prevalent in education, one of the biggest is gossip and avoidance. We are so committed to stability and to creating a safe, loving environment, and we grew up in that world, that we tend to avoid things like unbelievably. We are like ninjas when it comes to avoiding tough conversations. And that problem is that it leads to all sorts of unintended downstream effects, and it creates this vicious cycle. So for instance, I avoid something. So then what I do, I got to get it out. So I'm going to talk to you about it, which is a form of gossip, right? Or I go into the teacher's lawn and create more gossip. And so the superintendents, if you're listening, if you do nothing else, if you get nothing else out of this conversation for the next year, go to work on not avoiding stuff that you know you're avoiding and just see what happens. I guarantee you it'll produce all sorts of fruit.
That's fantastic advice. And sitting in the chair I'm sitting in, I think of how many times I have to do something difficult or do something uncomfortable. And that temptation to avoid is there. But that next step that you talked about clearly happens. I can point to specific times in my life where I've avoided a difficult conversation. And then, somebody, as Brene Brown puts it, we have our square squad. Somebody in my square squad will come in and I'll say, you know what? And the gossip starts. And so that's a really powerful piece of advice.
Yeah, because and it's okay to talk about somebody else. This is a little contrary to what's out there, but it just acknowledges that we're going to do it anyway. And too many times we have these like leadership developments where it's like, if you're a good leader, you should do these 10 things, which means if you're a bad leader, you do these 10 things. Well, we think that's ridiculous. The reality is we all do all 20 of those things. And sometimes we're just not conscious of what we're doing, which is why we need people around us to help us wake up and to say, hey, Chris, did you catch what you're doing? Oh, yeah. Good catch, right? And you get back into being more productive. And so the key here is that you can conspire for somebody or you can conspire against them. Gossip is a passive complaint with no commitment to helping somebody else. So it's conspiring against them. But it's okay if you and I are talking about how to help Sally, we're conspiring for her because our intention is to help her. So it's okay if we talk about that so we can put a plan together to help her. And too often we don't think about it that way. We just go straight to, oh my gosh, can you believe it?
Like I said, that's, that hits close to home. I can think of multiple occasions where I've done a little bit of both. So that's important to know. And again, to bring it back to the whole idea of unconscious, that makes that person that's going to point it out for you even more important. And the idea of building relationships and to making sure you have those people around you that will point that out is incredibly important to being a better leader.
Yeah, and not just at the workplace, by the way. One of my best coaches is my wife, because for the last 7 years, probably, we've gone to work on becoming better at helping each other, at coaching each other. And about 95% of the time we can, and about 5% we're like, nope, go away. I can't take it right now. But just a few weeks ago, Chris, I was saying, hey, babe, I'm really, I'm nervous about this speech that I have to give, And she cut me off before I finished. She said, you have to? And those 3 words woke me up. I became conscious and I realized I was whining and complaining about a speech that I get to give to several hundred people. They're buying copies of our book and they work in the elder care space. What a gift, what an honor. And this is what transformational leadership's all about, by the way, is we have to transform our thinking from fear-based, which is me, worried about what do people think about me, to love-based, to agape love, to being of service to others. And when we can do that, that is transformation. We're transforming our thinking like my wife did for me, from stop thinking about yourself, Tom, stop whining, to thinking about the audience and the value I get to bring to them. And when you can make that shift, that's the essence of transformation.
That's fantastic. You've done so much work around this that you've put it into an excellent book, that you're practicing it in your personal life. And that's even different. You don't hear a lot of leaders talking about practicing leadership skills and becoming a transformational leader in their personal life. And I think that's especially important when you're talking about the type of transformation that you're explaining, where you're becoming awake. And it's a transformation of perspective of how you're approaching things and looking at things. Do I have that right?
We say constantly to our partners, our clients, people we work with, that we have not mastered this work and we are not above this work. We're trying to be it. And literally, we do our work in pairs usually. In front of clients, we will coach each other because we want them to see something that maybe I'm not seeing. So Brad will say something to me and say, hey, Tom, did you just notice that you made a joke to take the tension out of the room because it was getting a little bit tense? The problem is that just relieved the pressure of that person having a breakthrough. And I'll be like, oh yeah, good catch. And then the pressure's back on again, right?
Yeah.
Now, we're not looking to always create pressure. That's probably a bad example that scares people. But the idea there is that it doesn't have to be heavy. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It's just helping when we care for each other, then we can help each other see things that we're not aware of, that we're not conscious to in the moment. And because it's at the end of the day, life's too short. It's not about us, right? Really good servant leadership is not about us. It's about the results that we get produced through the team. And if we can get our freaking ego out of the way, it really doesn't matter. We can have any conversation we need to, and it's just not that big of a deal.
So with all your work on leadership and all your coaching, if you weren't studying leadership and practicing transformational leadership and coaching, who, not what would you be?
Oh boy, I'd probably still be working for that large company that we talked about earlier, and I'd probably be making $1 million a year, and I'd probably be miserable.
I love the idea that you just said I'd be making $1 million a year and I'd be miserable, because oftentimes, and this I'm sure has to do with some unconscious piece as well, oftentimes we equate that to being successful and to being happy. So, and unfortunately it's not.
The best job in the world is working with kids, period, end of story, in my opinion. Kids are just unlimited potential. One of the things that we talk about in our work with leaders is look, your job is to lead giant children, grown children. We are all children. I know plenty of 7-year-old children. That's okay. When we can see our colleague down the hall as just a grown child, it changes how we look at them. They're no longer, you would never be like, oh my gosh, I can't, gossiping about a third grader, right? Or gossiping about a first grader. But then we do it with people that are only 20 years older. That doesn't make sense, right? So a lot of this work is just doing what we do for kids naturally and doing it for each other as adults.
So that said, what's the most important piece of advice you would give to leaders as they work to better support, engage, and empower those they serve?
That's a tough one.
Is that another show?
Yeah, I think I had a guy on my podcast. We talked to superintendents and CEOs. Dan Varner is the CEO of Goodwill. And I've done dozens of these with leaders all across the country. And I asked him a similar question. And he said, love, Tom, just love. I just want to put more love into the world. And I think that would be mine. I think that's, at the end of the day, our job as leaders, I know this is going to sound a little airy-fairy and, whatever to people and a little bit woo-woo. But fundamentally, this is not just a feel-good emotion. It's very pragmatic. If you're a good organization, if you're a good business, you're providing value to other people. You're providing value to your customers. Well, that's really what agape love is about. It's putting others first. So this is not theoretical. This is very pragmatic. Even if you're the most capitalistic, money-hungry person in the world, that's what it means to run a good business, is to really provide that sort of love for your customers and provide value. And so I think that's really it. If you want to be a better leader, get really good at noticing your own fears and transform those into productive love for other people.
Well, Tom, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. You've given some fantastic advice. You've clarified some thinking that I know I have had myself, that I'm thinking some of the other listeners have had. And I think you've clarified it for the better to help us all become better leaders. You've offered some resources. And again, I just have to say, people have to pick up this book, a copy of this book. This is really, I know I keep beating that drum, but I read a lot of books. There are a lot of books I like, but there are a few books that I will definitely keep and refer back to over and over again and remember the title and different things in it. And this is definitely one of them. So thank you for spending the time and putting that out there. And I urge all the listeners to really pick up a copy of this and reach out to you if they have any questions or want to talk to you further. If they do that, what's the best way they can do that?
Yeah, pretty simple. Just tom@phoenixperform.com is my email. So TOM@Phoenix, like the city, Phoenix, PhoenixPerform.com. Fairly active on LinkedIn. You can find me there as well. And obviously, there'll be some links in the show notes as well.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me on. This has been a lot of fun.
Well, that's a wrap, but not the end. Next step, be sure to take action on something you heard here today. Hey, thanks for listening to the Seeing to Lead podcast. If you would like to connect for any reason, email me at drchrissj@gmail.com or catch me on Twitter at drcsjones. If you've gotten any value from the Seeing to Lead podcast today, you can help me and other leaders create a world-class environment through a teacher-centric approach by subscribing to the show, leaving an honest rating and review, and sharing this episode on social media with your most valuable takeaway. Also, one last thing. Have you had a chance to pick up my latest 5-star rated book yet? Grab your copy of Seeing to Lead anywhere you buy books or at seeingtolead.com. That's SEEINGTOLEAD.com, where you can learn more and continue to improve. Now go have a successful week.